Welcome Francis McWhannell and Joy, and he's going to just take over.
Thanks, Richard. Kia ora koutou. So, as Richard kindly said, my name's Francis McWhannell. I wear rather a large number of hats. I am, as Richard has said, the curator of the Fletcher Trust collection. I run an art gallery, Season, over in Grey Lynn with my dear friend Jay Townsend, who has joined us today. And I also write about art when I can find the time. It's a real pleasure to be here at the auction at International Arts Centre, within the viewing I should say. It's an unusually strong auction. I'm always hesitant about saying things like that, especially in the context of an auction house that has to keep making them all the time. But I think there's a really particularly beautiful selection of works in this showcase. And I was very excited. It was an immediate yes to the offer of speaking today for precisely that reason, because there's such an interesting range of different works in the presentation. My knowledge is, alas, not as encyclopedic as Richard has intimated, so I will have to acknowledge gaps in knowledge if they reveal themselves. Hopefully they won't, and I'll look really clever. In thinking through what to do, I thought about what sort of might notionally be first. And as those of you who've read the catalogue will have noticed, there's a lovely essay by Linda Tyler on Ralph Hoteri's work. It's that work in black with the beautiful yellow circle scored on it, pressing up against the red bar. And I thought that might be a nice place to start because, as has been suggested recently by Nigel Burrell through his exhibition Toi Tu Toyota at Auckland Art Gallery Toyotamaki, these works that are correctly situated in the tradition of minimalist abstraction, geometric abstraction, are also legible as making reference to te kore and te pō, the sort of very beginning of time in Māori cosmology. And this is not as I say, this is not an exclusive interpretation. Certainly Hoteri was firmly grounded in abstraction and in the Euro-American tradition of the same. It's not at all inappropriate that references are made to Ad Reinhardt, or a reference is made to Ad Reinhardt in the catalogue, and I don't wish to downplay that dimension of his practice. I don't think he would have appreciated that. And at the same time, I think it can be beautifully read as evocative of this time before time, this moment, te kore, the great nothing, but a nothing that is not a zero, really. It's pregnant with potential. So te kore or te kore is the sort of world of potential being, and out of that unfolds te whaiao, the emergent light of day, the emergent light of creation, and then the world of life and light, tau marama, unfolds and creates the space that we occupy today. So I thought that starting with that work and gesturing to its two traditions, the minimal and the abstract, but also the symbolic, and acknowledging the fact that works always make themselves available, no matter how abstract, to a viewer response, would be a nice way to kick off. To flow on naturally to the work that's sitting next to it, we have Fred Graham's Hobson's Choice. I did a bit of a double take when I read this title because I think, as was probably intended, I thought of Hobson's Pledge. This work is from 2012, and so it is firmly situated in that political moment in which Hobson's Pledge was circulating. It seems a timely work to be contending with today, given some of the political complexities that we're experiencing right now. But it's a work, of course, that is not referring directly to Hobson's Pledge, at least not in its title, but rather to Hobson's choice, a choice that really is a false choice, where there is really only one potential decision to be made. Quite what relationship that has to the rangatira figure that we're looking at, wearing his kahu and holding the sheath of paper, which one suspects is intended to allude to te tiriti o Waitangi. Whether that choice is that for Māori there is only one possible way of understanding te tiriti, and that is as a document that testifies to Māori sovereignty enduring tino rangatiratanga, as enshrined in that document. The one notion might be that te tiriti has one interpretation only. The more sort of troubling possibility is the notion that perhaps there was only one option available to Māori at the point of colonisation, that there was not meaningful agency available at the time that certain critical decisions were being made. It's obviously a work of strength. This is a figure of power, a very beautiful figure, and one I think with interpretations as complex as the hōteri, which is so stylistically different. Graham, of course, was, like hōteri, interested in bridging this space between traditional customary making, and modernism. And so he exists in this presentation as a sort of artist who is speaking to multiple traditions in the same way that hōteri is. So I think the pairing of those two works is really quite appropriate. I'll move to a third work, which I think is, yes, it's just here, since it's available to us. This is Rongopai Restoration by McWhannell, and it shares some of the same dimensions that are in the hōteri and the Graham. This work is one of 3 in the auction, all very beautiful. This one was particularly interesting to me, partly because of its title. Rongopai, which can be translated as gospel, is a reference, of course, to the painted whare of that same name. And McWhannell, who was an absolute Renaissance man, had so many different strings to his bow, had as one of his projects the restoration of Rongopai. It was not, he did not undertake the project alone, of course, but was part of the team that saw to the restoration of the whare. Now, this is a very important whare. It speaks to lots of different histories. It's a ringatu building, and therefore speaks to Te Koti's ringatu movement, which is a movement that drew parallels, and in this Te Koti was not alone, with the Māori people and the Israelites as a group that were persecuted and had suffered hardship, but would ultimately triumph, would ultimately be strong. And the ringatu movement involved the creation of whare, many of which were carved as opposed to painted, but their most famous whare is painted, and that's Rongopai. Rongopai has been a reference for lots and lots of artists for a number of reasons, partly because it's a relatively, it's a special example of a marrying of, again, customary modes of making, customary modes of depicting the world, drawing on this ancient wellspring of toi Māori, and also a space in which experimentation was possible. So the house has the most extraordinary figurative drawings, figurative paintings, mixed in with elements of what we think of maybe as more traditional kōwhaiwhai, so scroll patterns and the like. Rongopai was also a reference point for Gordon Walters, and it seems opportune to sort of gesture to him. He, of course, is at the entranceway opposite, on the other side of the desk from the Ralph hōteri work. Have a look at that later. With McWhannell, he gives this work, Rongopai Restoration, I think, in acknowledgement of that connection that he had to the restoration project. But of course, the term restoration has further connotations as well, connotations of renewal, rejuvenation, survival in spite of problems. We might think of the kind of Catholic Reformation and attempts at reform from within, the project of betterment through searching through how things have been done. So this is 2 years after the hikoi, led by Whina Cooper, down to Parliament, which started in the north with a relatively small group of people and gathered momentum. By the time they arrived at Parliament, I believe there were in the region of 50,000 people in the hikoi, and Nin, I believe, also was among them. Certainly it's a movement, it's an action that was referred to in many of his works, and I make mention of it because there's this little cortege of figures down the bottom here, and a little figurative moment of a sort of cityscape in the background. So the next work that I'd like to treat is really a complete jump. I'm talking about Garth Tapper's The Architects, which is a work more recent than it looks. It's tucked away here. It's one that immediately caught my eye. It probably has something to do with the fact of running the Fletcher Trust collection. We have a very large collection of industrial themed works. And so I've got a bit of a love affair with industrial works. This I love for a number of reasons. One, because I feel the strong influence, or even possibly a kind of dimension of homage going on to John Weeks. I was sort of Googling around this morning, doing my sort of scramble to confirm a hunch. And I don't know for absolutely certain that Tapper studied directly under Weeks, but he was certainly at Elam at a time that Weeks was also there. So he must have known his work. And I mean, Weeks loomed so large that he couldn't possibly not have. But what to me is Weeksy about it is all of that beautiful treatment of the faceting of colour and the multidimensionality of the colour, particularly across things like the forearm of this man here. Just wonderful, sort of. I mean, if you look at it in isolation, it's almost sort of creepy and corpse-like. But taken as part of the whole composition, it's just so beautiful and atmospheric. You have these wonderfully kind of strong compositional devices, those amazing concrete pipes stretching back into space, the kind of abstraction of the site behind with a sort of red that's, you know, most likely of some kind of tractor, but also, you know, could be an industrial building painted a nice safety orange to make sure that nobody inadvertently reverses into it. And then the figures, of course, sort of intently at their work. It's not out of sync with what I think of when I think of Tapper. You know, he was a wonderful observer of bodily expression and facial expression. There's often a slightly cartoony quality to his work. He would almost caricature. Speaking of the High Court, you know, one of his sort of masterpieces is this multi-person portrait, this group portrait set within the High Court. Well, within a court. I'm not 100% sure what his subject is now that I say it out loud. And obviously talking back to the tradition of the group portrait, thinking in terms of things like Rembrandt and the Dutch tradition. But just quite a wry, funny treatment of figures. And here I think we get something a lot more serious and, dare I say, respectful. One doesn't get the sense that he's really making fun of the architects, although he might perhaps be suggesting that they're a little humorless. But it's a sort of beautifully thought through and composed work. My tenuous connection from Tapper is going to be through Elam, and the connection comes now to Binny, one of the great masterpieces of the show. It's Kōtari over Wainamu, which I keep wanting to say Waimanu, but I believe it's Wainamu, and is a work that has rhythms in Binny's practice, as is acknowledged in the very good essay by Gregory O'Brien, who of course is the great Binny scholar. And the earliest work, I want to say it was from 1965, check your catalogues for me, and it has Kōtari over Hikurangi. And so it's a kōtari flying in the opposite position. Now, the reason that O'Brien makes reference to this work is that it's a very strongly compositionally similar kōtari. There is, of course, another, probably the more famous of the kōtari paintings, which is kōtari over the Ratana Church, in which the kōtari is much more abstracted. It's got a sort of spear-like nose and is a sort of stridently modernist kōtari. In the kōtari over Hikurangi, it's more like this one, but flipped, as O'Brien notes in the essay. And what he sort of wishes to acknowledge in referring to this kōtari is the process of digging through Binny's own practice, that he was an artist who would constantly reach back into his own kind of visual source book, and motifs that had been explored in the past would sort of re-emerge in new contexts. The personal connection, of course, is that this is near Te Hinga, near Bethel's Beach, where Binny had a studio for many years, a sort of retreat, and a space which was clearly his sort of chosen place of origin, his chosen reference point. O'Brien refers to it as his chosen tūranga waiwai, which I think is appropriate given the way that Binny thought about the land and thought about his relationship to place. The work has beautiful little flourishes. I think perhaps the most darling element, if I can use that word and not sound condescending, is the little sphere sitting atop the mountain, or the hillside, just to disrupt that kind of sharp contour line. This little, like a little punctuation mark. You almost imagine him adding it right at the last minute, as if to just say, now you're done. It, of course, also has a lovely sort of play, and formal games in Binny's work are always worth talking about. The sort of the classic story about the works as expressions of his care for the environment, his sense that birds are these sort of ancient beings whose relationship to the physical environment is one that is kind of grounded, is toe, is right, is kind and gentle and sustainable, is of course there and of course important. O'Brien makes reference to the fact that the kōtari is conceptually connected to the tides, and that in sort of the Māori understanding, a kōtari is a sort of figure for a sentry, as in S-E-N-T-R-Y, sentry, a sentinel, a guardian, a watch person. And of course this relates to the bird's practice, right? So a kōtari will sort of sit perfectly still, perching in wait, and then when it's ready to attack, it's sudden, it's swift, it's masterfully executed. So it becomes an ideal figure for the sort of perfect guard, the perfect watch person. The kōtari here, of course, is implicitly sweeping, but also the way its head is turned upward suggests this upward flight as well. It's as if it is able to move in multiple directions at once. And then you have the beautiful kind of watchful eye marked out in this glorious gold, which connects so beautifully with the little spot on top of the hillside, a little neat juxtaposition, kind of accentuating that diagonal up through the sky. The colour, how can you go past the colour? This kōtari is special in that it is sort of an essay in ultramarine. It's not everywhere in the painting, of course, but all of those beautiful tonalities in the kōtari's wings are also running through the landscape. I can't help but feel as though there's a little bit of a conversation back to kind of nascent modernist landscape in New Zealand, the so-called regionalist tradition, a term I hate, by the way, but there we are. I think of Angus and her beautiful watercolours, of alpine scenes in Te Waipounamu, the South Island, where the sort of shadows, the coolness of the shadows across a mountainside become these rich blues. And then I think too of the art historical traditions that are inevitably evoked when you play with ultramarine. Ultramarine blue is that sort of glorious sacred colour, that very expensive colour because it was made of lapis from Afghanistan, that it was, it was a rich colour, it was a heavenly royal colour. We see it on the garments of the Virgin Mary. We see it, occasionally used to excess when the funds permitted it. You think of Giotto's Scrivani Chapel and all of the kind of glorious blue used there because they had the money. And the claims that made. But here it's this sort of sacred, inspirited blue. The richness is a spiritual richness. It's the blue of the wairua of the land and the way it connects with the bird. This is, this is the manu in communion with the landscape that sustains it. And it's a call to us all to do better in the way that we relate to the landscape. I think it's sort of inevitable and necessary that the next work I talk about be the Albrecht, the great big singing symphony of an Albrecht. I'm particularly enthusiastic about these hemispheres. You actually get a bit of a sneak peek at the physicality of these works, the way that they were, at least early on, created with the production of these two quadrants rather than, a true hemisphere, a true, what's the word I'm looking for? It's right there in the title, the lunette. There's a sort of happy alignment with this body of work of Albrecht's and some of the themes that I've hit on already with the notion of the formal not being incompatible with the kind of conceptually rich or the evocative. Albrecht, as is pointed out in the catalogue, has given this work the title Lunette Silken. Silken, what better word could there be for a work that almost feels as though it's expressing the process of making a silkscreen print, these kind of swathes of ink running across the surface of the work, or inky paint I should say, running across the surface of the work. Everybody comments about the way that these are expressive of process, that these are sort of testaments to the dance that is the making of a painting when you're working with gesture, as Albrecht so often does. These are the sweeps of her arm, and you sort of keep wanting to do that every time you see them. I remember a friend of mine saying, I so love Gretchen's windscreen wiper paintings. And it sounds silly and crass, and it's something that I only repeat because I think that that quality of the movement is actually correct. So windscreen wiper it is not, but it certainly has that press, that gesture. The works are also, of course, extremely sophisticated as kind of compositional experiments. Some of them play with quite muted balances across the two quadrants. You'll have sort of one which is, and I say quadrant, you know, because we always imagine that this could be a whole circle if we wanted it to be. But this one has a beautiful kind of dance and balance across the two. It's almost disruptive in the way that she gives you all of this glorious pink and then that kind of contrasting green, which is much sort of stickier too when you get in close. You see the passage in pink, this kind of watermelon part of the painting. The pink is sort of inky and soft and ethereal, and then the green's quite assertive and sticky, much more like an oil. And then, of course, it goes over the blue. And so you sort of, your brain almost wants to do something oppositional on this side and go, okay, well, if there's green here, what will be on this other side to answer it? But she denies us that. She's not going to give us the exact balance. It's not really about symmetry at all. And so, yes, there is a passage of a sort of cyan blue that runs down, and again, it's a little bit more like the green. It's a different kind of paint quality. But it's not an easy opposition. It's not a painting that sort of gives you the balance that maybe you expect or even desire. At least three works that I would like to cover are the Moffat, the Thomason and the Kahukiwa. Let's take the Thomason first because it's nearest. It's a real shift in temperament, but a truly wonderful work. Dates to 1971 or thereabouts. Can date that fairly concretely because of its presentation at an exhibition at the Rue Pompallier Gallery, and this ties to a moment in Thomason's life. He was incarcerated for a relatively short period of time and produced a body of works that I think inevitably get read with a degree of biography attached to them. This work is particularly mysterious. How to interpret it? We have obviously prison bars, that much is clear. We have Thomason's kind of classical use of a found support, which he's then turned into a painting support. It's a sort of window frame over which he's stretched Hessian and then sort of treated it to make it available for painting on. That Hessian, of course, not exclusive to Thomason. The other two artists who we think, or three artists who we think of using it, of course, McWhannell, the big one, but also Alan Maddox and Phil Claremont both made fairly extensive use, much to conserve it as horror of this very unarchivally friendly material. But this work of Thomason's uses that and exploits that toothiness, that sort of renegade roughness of the Hessian to add to the expressive quality of the work. We have what we assume is some sort of a child. Can't help but wonder if it's not a child that is also a sort of a self-portrait. Doesn't look especially like Thomason, but maybe if you squint. With hands up to the head. I mean, I hardly need to do the pose, he's right there. But, and that grimace on the face, and then all of these qualities of the sort of sagging of the skin around the neck and the way that that is reinforced by the ripples on the shirt. It actually makes me think a little bit of certain works by Michael Smither, which have, you know, depictions of flesh that are sort of mannered and stylized and a little bit kooky, creepy even, but are sort of playing formal games as well, you know, where the skin, the flesh becomes sculptural. You sort of see folds of fabric in marble sculpture, say, but it's turned into a body, and so it's strange, but also sort of monumental. And the figure is, I mean, larger than life. It's not a big painting by any means, but it packs a big punch. I think it could hold a very large wall, more or less, on its own. And it's a work, I don't wish to make any assumptions about what the interpretation ought to be. It seems strange to see a child behind bars, and I think the natural inclination, perhaps particularly because of the black space behind, is to read this child as the one who's entrapped. But another interpretation that is plausible is that, the blackness is more metaphorical, and it's not the black of a cell that the child is in, but rather a sort of obscured, abstracted black background, and that we are the ones who are imprisoned looking at this child who is lamenting our imprisonment. And I think it's worth giving some consideration to what Thomason might have been thinking about post his experience in prison, which after all wasn't terribly long. And he must have been aware that many people were in prison for much longer periods of time, and possibly for crimes that to him felt relatively insignificant, as he no doubt felt that his own kind of drug issue for which he'd been put away was something that was perhaps not totally of his own making, but something that had sort of happened to him as well. I mean, I don't want to make any assumptions about whether he felt any kind of sense of responsibility or agency, but I can well imagine him thinking through the ways that people get to places that are very dark and the effects that it might have on little children who are on the other side of the bars on visiting day. Very grim place to go to, but there we are. Some other works that I sort of said that I would mention. One is Moffat, and he sits very conveniently above Alfred Sharp, who I'd also like to make mention of very briefly. I feel as though it's very easy to kind of gloss over the colonial stuff because, colonial watercolours are not sort of as at the peak of their popularity at the moment, and also because there are certain awkwardnesses that emerge when looking at their histories. But Sharp I have a real soft spot for, and partly because he was animated by an interest in conservation. He shared that because he was not the only landscape painter in the kind of colonial period, whatever that means, sort of up to about 1900, who had that as an interest area. Blomfield was the same, and both wrote about their environmental concerns. Both were very concerned at deforestation in particular. They sort of were horrified by the idea of rampant exploitation of the ngahere for commercial purposes. This little work has, I'll sort of get in close and you'll have to come in later and have a little look, but there's a wee figure walking in the background here with something over his arm. It's not entirely clear whether it's a swag. The temptation's to read it as a swag, and in the hands of another artist we'd sort of almost read it as some sort of an emblem of quote-unquote civilization, the world's biggest scare quotes if you can imagine them. Anyway, he's walking along in the background here. He could also be carrying some kind of an implement, an axe or something like that. But he's moving through, I'm assuming moving through this bush. And it's also interesting to query whether he might be a sort of figure for the artist as well, occupying this extraordinary arrangement. Sharp's use of watercolour is very beautiful. He often gets kind of talked about at the same time as George O'Brien, who had a similar kind of technique, loved to play with opacity as well as transparency and really get in and put in these sort of little flashes of white, these sort of gouache moments, all of this white around the water, picking up on the highlights. It's a work that doesn't have obvious references to shifts in the natural environment, but the inclusion of that figure in there as this kind of human in relation to nature, I think is significant. If the figure weren't there, it could be called baldly romantic, because the figure is there and we have to query whether this is someone who loves that space, somebody who's maybe even a painter who's going to document that space or make a sort of loving response to it, or whether that's the kind of intrusion of this human element into a space that is special, and because the human is there, might not be so special for so long. Is I think important to consider. Above that is another. I'm doing the dark corner. It's from Thomason into Sharp and into Moffat. This is a work from a very large series of works referring to episodes in the artist's father's life, and we have obviously these veterans coming back from the war. They have a sort of notional triumphalism, right, with the sort of flags hanging up, and the group here to welcome them home. But can you imagine a less kind of triumphant, less celebratory scene with this chap who's had his leg blown off? And it's just totally not the triumphant sort of image that you might expect to see. This is not, Queen Street with confetti flying down from the sky and a sense of celebration. This is the sort of reality of a group coming home to small town New Zealand, forever changed by the experience of going to war. And it's, I'm sure, it sort of feeds into this recurrent interest that Moffat has in masculine psychology, I think, men's psychology, the difficulties of contending with different kinds of trauma. And sometimes that trauma is the trauma of war. Sometimes for Moffat that trauma is the trauma of using Stanley Graham as a reference for what happens when you don't have an opportunity as a man to kind of talk about your feelings. He does, of course, other things as well. He does sort of fishing out in the environment. He does sweeping landscapes and celebration of the Kaya River. It's not all dark, but certainly a constant kind of theme in his work is this kind of emotional complexity felt on the part of men. We're getting to the point where I probably need to wrap things up, and so I'm going to end with this large work, this extraordinary work by Robin Kahukiwe. It's one of 3 panels of broadly equal scale, and they were substantially similar in compositional approach. So they all have a figure on one side, or in one case it's in the background in the centre, which is based on whakairo, on Māori carving. And we see sort of conventions that Robin developed within her own practice to kind of indicate this tradition of toi whakairo. So she kind of drew freely and reinterpreted, reimagined. Robin is this great inventor. She will always sort of draw on a wellspring and then push something in her own direction, come up with her own way of doing things. And so this kind of figure type is immediately recognisable. I mean, on this left-hand side, as you face the work, this figure type is sort of immediately legible as a Kahukiwa style whakairo grouping. And of course you have the great sort of mother figure, and then the female figure at the dominating, and then the male figure down the bottom, sort of looking upwards. And this acknowledges the space of tradition, of the tupuna, of the ancestors, stretching all the way back to the atua at the beginning of time, emerging out of te kore, te pō, and into te ao marama. This space is the space that is deep time, the past that we're always looking back at in order to measure our present and our future. We have to be constantly looking to our ancestors for sustenance and knowledge. On this other side, we have the implicit line of ancestry, the whakapapa, where this woman here, suggested in black and white, becomes a natural descendant of the figure on the other side. And so she's shown in black and white. I think essentially the sort of art historical connection is that an immediately preceding body of work, or a preceding body of work from a couple of years earlier, Robin was looking at photographs of Māori women in the so-called unidentified Māori women file at the National Library. So lots of images of wahine who maybe had generic titles like Māori Belle or something equally kind of culturally chauvinistic, and kind of mercantile, frankly, images that were intended to serve a tourist market, that were not about acknowledging the specific identity of the figure, but rather to abstract, look at beautiful New Zealand and our lovely Māori ladies, that kind of thing. Very cringe-inducing. And so she was wanting to reclaim those figures and went into the unidentified Māori women file, pulled them out and made her own paintings. And she set the images of the women painted in black and white to evoke the photographic origins of the imagery, alongside colour images that were strongly based on the same women. So there was a sort of suggestion that on the one hand, they had colour put into them, they had life put back into them. And we could sort of look at that here. We could say, this is the living, breathing, fully human identified version of the woman whose identity is lost here. But of course she's also a descendant. She functions as a kind of granddaughter figure for whoever this wahine is. This wahine is clearly a woman of status, and a thing that Robin was very interested in was the notion that some of those tupuna figures who had become unidentified were in fact, if you could just reach into the photograph and greet them, they could tell you all about their whakapapa. But actually people of the present suffered a different issue, where they may have an understanding, a full understanding and owning of their identity day to day, but they had had their connections to their whakapapa diminished. They maybe didn't know where their tūranga waiwai is. They didn't have a home marae that they visited. So they were contending with complexities that their tūpuna hadn't, and their tūpuna were contending with complexities that they weren't. Having said all of that, I don't think that this is a work that is focused on that space of unknowing. In this body, Tuakiri identify Robin as kind of pushing into a new space. And the title of the work, which was sort of similar in another work from the same series, is making reference to the chiefly ancestry and the way that this persists through whakapapa. And so the notion in the work is that you always have available to you your chiefly ancestors. You can always rely on your illustrious past. And that whakapapa prepares you, strengthens you, and makes it possible always for future flourishing. That's what sets up this woman in the front here, who is sort of a woman of the present, or at least of the 1990s when the work was painted. That's what set her up to flourish into the future, because she could always look back at this illustrious past, this past full of strength. The things that happen in between, they're real, they're difficult, and they require strength to contend with them, but that strength is there. That strength is always there. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was lovely to speak to you all, and I hope you enjoy continuing to look around.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.